We'll just start in a minute. There are a lot of people flying into this Zoom meeting, so we'll just let people land. All right, good afternoon, and a really big welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us on Zoom today. My name's Adrienne Crowder. I work with the Wellington Guelph Drug Strategy, and my job today will be to introduce and close our session and introduce our speaker. So a really warm welcome to everybody who's attending, and for those of you who were perhaps at last week's session, welcome back. So this is the second of a three-part series. So just this is a reminder that next week at the same time, so December 9th, 1 to 2:30, we will have a session on promising practices around working with people with crystal meth. So we have two sets of speakers. The first is a team of presenters coming from the Toronto Drop-In Network, coming from the neighborhood group, and they will be really working on how they bring the expertise and strengths and leaderships of people who are using meth into designing and delivering their service programs. So I think that will be really interesting. And then the second speaker we will have is Gail Parker. She's a nurse practitioner working out of the Working Center who's been exploring different safe supply processes for stimulants. So she will be sharing her learnings in that department. At our first session last week, for those of you who were here, this is a reminder, we had Dr. Tim Guimond who led us through an overview of how crystal meth increases dopamine supply to the brain and how that impacts brain function and behavior. What he also shared, which is really important for today's session, is that our current pharmaceutical options to address crystal meth dependence are really limited, and that the best option to support people who use meth are psychosocial strategies. So that's perfect for our today, which we're going to be looking at how we effectively support people who are experiencing crystal meth psychoses and other adverse effects from their meth use. So just before I begin, I'd really like to thank Stonehenge Therapeutic Community. They were the organization that provided us with funds to have this three-part training series. I'd also like to just send gratitude to Nick Boyce at the Ontario Harm Reduction Network and Janet Stevenson from St. Stephen's House, because they really helped us develop the content for the sessions. And information for you, we are recording the sessions and they will be put up on the Drug Strategy website. We're always a little slower than we want to be, so give us a week or two, but it will be there for future reference. We have a really simple agenda for today. The first is in a minute or two, I'm just going to introduce our speaker and hand the show over to her. We will have time at the end for question and answers. We've tried to give ourselves a fairly long stretch to do that. And then of course we'll close. And throughout the Zoom format, what really asks if you can please use the chat function to send any comments and questions. That chat function is being monitored. So the questions you put in will be collected and fed back to Sanda so she has a chance to get to them in a timely way. All right, so let's get to what you all signed up for. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Sanda Kazazic. So Sanda is a mental health and social work professional, and she's very passionate about working with individuals who experience housing, mental health, and substance use challenges. She works from a person-centered, harm reduction, and trauma-informed, low-barrier approach in order to create safe and inclusive spaces for program and service delivery. Sanda is currently the drop-in manager at All Saints Community Church in downtown Toronto East. And take it away, Sanda.
Let me just quickly share my screen with everyone. Hi, everyone. I'm really glad to be here today. I'm very used to delivering this content in person. So just wanted to share that it's still a learning process for me. It can be a little bit weird because it feels like I'm talking to myself. If you have any questions, as Adrienne mentioned, please feel free to put them in the chat. I also wanted to let you know, I do share my work email at the end of the presentation. If anything comes up that we don't cover or you think is very specific to your workplace, please feel free to contact me. I also might rush a little bit through the first part of presentation, depending on what we learned, who's on call. And I wanted to spend a little bit more on the second half of presentation, which is kind of individual best practices for working with people when they're experiencing crystal meth related crisis, not just psychosis. So why me? As Adrian mentioned, I've been working in psychology and mental health for more years than I care to share. But the last 7 years, I've kind of find my niche, and I realized that I'm very passionate working with people who are dealing with housing challenges, who are primarily homeless, street involved. And as part of this work, one of the trends that emerged is that like agencies that I was working with, there were a lot of service restrictions, there were a lot of barriers that were directly related to the crisis or psychosis that people were experiencing due to crystal meth use. And we realized that we have to change something in the way we're addressing the not just the behaviors, but also how we're as an agency are providing support to these individuals because they were frequently cut off from services. So this became kind of a passion of mine. I have to share with you that a lot of learning that I'm sharing with you today is not a direct result just of my experience. It's really as a result of kindness and generosity and willingness to be vulnerable of the people we work with. They have been my biggest teachers in the last 7 years. And a lot of these best practices emerged in direct as a direct result of what they shared with us was helpful for them in those moments. Sorry, my screen is refusing to go forward. Erin, if you wouldn't mind just sharing the first poll. So I just wanted to have a better idea of who's on call. And the reason I'm kind of lumping together crystal meth and homelessness is another thing that kind of I've learned over the last 6-7 years. Is, if person was homeless and using crystal meth, there were high chances that there was correlation between these two things for people to have frequent interactions with healthcare system, with criminal justice system, with social service agencies. And also the trend was among people that we're working with who were experiencing homelessness, there was kind of a sudden rise in use of crystal meth. So I won't be talking just about homelessness, but I will be bringing this up quite a bit because, as I said, from what we've noticed in the field in Toronto, at least, but I've heard it in other places as well, there's a huge correlation between not having stability, not having a home, and likelihood that the person's going to experience psychosis. I also want to put a disclaimer out. It's not my intent in any shape or form to vilify crystal meth as a drug. I mean, a lot of people I know, a lot of people I work with use the drug recreationally without any of the effects that we're talking about. But as the need in the field is to kind of understand how to best to support people, that's why we're talking about like this kind of subset of potentially, negative consequences that people are experiencing, and then the behaviors that might come across as challenging in the field. I hope that makes sense. So this is kind of an overview of what we're gonna cover. As I said, it's not just gonna be about homelessness, and it's not gonna be just about psychosis. I'll talk a bit about that as well, because there are kind of a few different points in the timeline of use when a person might experience crisis, even if they're not experiencing psychosis. I'm also not reinventing the wheel by any means. Like a lot of the strategies that I'm sharing with you are kind of an adoption of best de-escalation practices in mental health and social services, but kind of tweaked in a way that changes how we perceive the interaction or how we're perceiving our own behavior and what we're sharing with the person to make us more comfortable in that interaction, and also to increase the person's sense of safety and well-being, which might look a little bit different than typical crisis in our field. I also do bring out throughout the presentation, not just at the end, our personal biases and questioning our own sort of not necessarily motives, but like our own feelings, potential, fears, anxieties that are underneath. I've seen that a lot, how the language changes when we're talking about someone who had a crisis related to crystal meth, how frequently people get labeled, how as a result of that language, we're kind of spreading anxiety to ourselves or potentially to our coworkers. And I really think it's an important topic to go through in order to really be comfortable in relating to people safely when they're in this crisis mode. So I mentioned homelessness and lack of stable housing. I know I've seen Dr. Guimau who shared his knowledge last week. Like I've seen his approach to therapy with people who are housed and who are not housed, and there were certain things that kept emerging for folks who are street involved, who are homeless, that kind of elevated the risk of them experiencing psychosis or crisis that's directly related to that use. And I mean, I put this in the form of a question because I'm sure a lot of you have experience with this as well, or you have thoughts just from kind of general knowledge about the field. But the thing is, like, it's not just about the drug itself, it's also about systemic and personal factors um, in the lives of people we work with that have kind of seen the spike in the use of crystal meth, especially among street involved folks. I've also been in touch with some of the colleagues like on the West Coast, in Alberta, and like they're kind of ahead of us in terms of this. I don't think we've experienced overload in our system as much as they have. And I just wanted to see that these were not things just typical for Toronto, for a large city, and they've shared a lot of similar insight. And I think like one of the big things about being homeless and or precariously housed versus using meth when you're housed is like the simplest thing is like when you decide or when you start crashing and you don't want to use anymore, just that access to home, to a safe place to sleep, can make a huge difference between person just kind of sleeping it off, going through that crash safely, versus the person deciding they have to use again in order to stay awake for a longer period of time, or being forced not to be able to sleep because the places they sleep are in public, drop-in respites, where the timing of their sleep is decided by the agency that they're accessing. And I think like on a basic logical sense, you can see directly correlation between these two and like how prolonged use can create all of these unwanted side effects over time. And why does this matter? I think it makes a huge difference in how we perceive the person's behavior, the desperation or I don't know, we've had a lot of situations like I worked in a drop-in that was only 4 hours a day where someone's crashed and they're like dead to the world, but we're forcing them to wake up because it's the end of the shift for us. And then the person starts acting out. Like, does it matter in this context that they don't have anywhere to go and that they're experiencing these like really severe, physically intense things that the sleep is the only thing that can help with that? I think it makes all the difference in how we're addressing that interaction. So I really think it does make a difference, knowing if the person's housed or not housed and what services they're accessing. It also makes a difference in terms of their support network, right? Like typically people who are housed are more likely to have a support system, to have friends or access to things that can support them through this. Whereas like folks who don't have these supports, they're usually dependent on us, on service providers to keep them safe or to help them through these experiences. So having that knowledge, I think, is really crucial. So what are some of the reasons we're seeing this rise in use of crystal meth? I mean, one of the things is it's cheaper than most of the things on the street. We've also seen a lot of correlation, like or a lot of co-occurrence of people who are typical opioid users using crystal meth to kind of like level off and vice versa. People who are typical crystal meth users reaching out for opioids to kind of bring themselves down. And as you can imagine, since we're in the midst of opiate crisis, that presents a whole new level of challenges for people. And as I mentioned, like one of the primary reasons that people have shared with me, or like with other staff who work with me, is like they use crystal meth to stay awake. It becomes like something way beyond just chasing that high. It's a matter of survival. It's a way to keep their stuff safe, to keep themselves safe, especially if they can't find a safe place to sleep. And I mean, I worked with people who shared like being up for 10 days straight, like with no sleep. So I mean, I don't know, with or without crystal meth, I'm thinking like when I don't sleep well 3 nights in a row, all sorts of behaviors start to emerge. And like if you put it in this context, the chemical effects of crystal meth compounded with this, I think it should shift the empathy factor, and kind of understanding that the person's coming more from a fear perspective rather than aggression perspective when they start to exhibit certain behaviors. I'm sure Dr. Guimont mentioned this, but like I think it's really, really relevant to our discussion. Half-life of a substance is time that it takes our body to process half the amount used. So you can see here the drastic difference between cocaine, MDMA, and methamphetamine. Like all stimulants, methamphetamine has like drastically longer half-life than other substances. What this means is that even though the person no longer feels that high, the high level of methamphetamine is still present in the system. So when the person decides to use again, to stay awake because they're not feeling that high, and that new amount kind of compounds the amount that's already in their body, that starts to wreak all sorts of havocs, like on our central nervous system, on the way they're perceiving reality. And if they do this a lot over a prolonged period of time, the likelihood that they're going to experience psychosis, if they have other compounding effects, increases drastically. So I think this is also really, really important to understand, in terms of the dynamic of how people we work with use. Understanding that overdose for crystal meth can look differently than the opiate ones. It has a lot to do with how much of the drug is already in the person's system. We're going to come back to this, and I'm sure for any of you who have worked with people experiencing homelessness, this is the cycle of use that's typical for someone who doesn't have housing. The cycle itself gives us a lot of knowledge in terms of how to interact with the person, or what, in terms of what you could potentially offer someone when they're experiencing crisis or experiencing psychosis. So lack of sleep is one of the biggest things that I keep mentioning. Like I've seen people, like when they pass out after use, it's like you can shake them. It's like they don't notice anything around them. They lose all sense of time, when they're using like this. They're not housed, they don't know if it's day or night. It also affects other aspects of their self-care. So it's like, like if someone doesn't know if it's Monday or Wednesday and they've been up for days, the chances that they're going to remember that doctor's appointment, or that they're going to remember to go take their meds, especially if the meds are daily dispensed at a pharmacy, or that they'll remember when they ate, when they drank, when they took care of their basic needs. All of this kind of goes out the window. So the person, all of these factors can affect how the person is expressing that crisis in the moment. It's also, overstimulation when you've been tired this long. So it's like little things. I mean, I know we didn't have a quiet place for people to sleep, or as I mentioned, would have to wake people up. But if I knew that someone was really at risk, and that kind of putting them out there is going to make things more dangerous for them, for our staff. A lot of time I've had people fall asleep on the floor in my office because I can shut the door. I can give them the safety of sleeping it off for a few hours without having to be woken up. And then it's not a nice words to use as leverage, but it's also, it creates this bond where they know that I'm going to go out of my way to help them, be better, or to support them, that I can then call on, during de-escalation, or where they're not feeling so great. Another thing that occurs, and I've seen this across the board, not just in social services and among people who are homeless. This is something that I've seen in ERs and probation offices, at the court, a lot of time, because um, these crisis moments keep reoccurring with people, like in the same context. So like certain people, become super well known in emergency rooms in certain hospitals. Security know them by sight, because they've expressed their issues. They acted out in a certain way, so they'll be labeled aggressive, violent. That's kind of how staff are going to communicate their perception of the person, even to someone they're working with who hasn't had that interaction. I've seen people discharged from case management plan, because they're labeled difficult to work with or to engage with. People don't feel safe around them. They end up being restricted, and losing access to a lot of services. And this is like, I'm not just talking drop-in centers. Like I've seen people get restrictions from central intake for shelter beds in Toronto on Peter Street. I've seen people restricted from not just the emergency room, but kind of like the public areas of hospitals. I've even seen police officers kind of know a person and sidestepping to respond to certain calls because they just can't be bothered, because they know it's going to be a time involved interaction with that person. Also, a lot of places where we work, especially if they're bigger organizations, they have to streamline their policies and procedures, and one size does not fit all. A lot of what we had to deal with 10 years ago is no longer the same for the people we work with. And someone can be super unwell today, and they might pose a safety risk for the space, but they sleep it off, they get some food, 48 hours, they're no longer a safety risk. But we still have this system of like, that mimics our criminal justice system, where it's like, this is, your transgression, this is your consequence or punishment, meaning you can't access the space for long periods of time. And it does not have anything to do with safety anymore. It's more about like parenting or trying to change the person's behavior, completely taking out the context that this behavior was a result of the drug that they were using, lack of sleep, lack of support. Another thing is, and I hear this a lot from workers who are interacting with folks, it's like, so you engage with someone who may not be a client, like on the street, they're experiencing crisis, where do you take them? It's like, Toronto is a big city with lots of services. Where do you take this person? I know a lot of times, like, the person's deemed a risk to themselves or to someone else, like physician puts them on form 1, they get taken to emergency room at KMH, anywhere that has psychiatric support. And I mean, my experiences has been, a lot of times the police didn't even finish the paperwork, the person's already discharged. And the thing is, they're discharged only because, there's knowledge or suspicion that they've used crystal meth. And again, I'm not criticizing individual workers. It's simply the way the system is set up. There's nothing in place that would appropriately support people using crystal meth. And I mean, at the end of the day, when a person's experiencing psychosis, does it really matter? Is it crystal meth induced? Or if it's like, mental health issues related, the experience is real for the person, the danger that they feel for themselves or harm that might come to them or to others is equally real. So are we as a system kind of failing to address these gaps? Because in the end, what ends up happening, person's discharged. If they don't have supports, they continue using until they escalate to a level where they do something that's deemed criminal, and then finally they're arrested. They're sitting in Toronto South, and that's kind of the best that we can do. And I don't mean to be negative, but I drill this to the staff that I work with, because we really, really have to think about this when we cut off person's access to our services or how we perceive them, right? It must be a really lonely place to be when everyone around you recognizes your face and kind of just associated with aggression or violence. So this was kind of, these three things are gonna keep recurring throughout our conversation. You know, that when we're de-escalating, yes, we're thinking about our own skills and what we can control. But you know, advocacy at a systems level, kind of navigating that from the point of view of the person that's experiencing crisis, I think it can do a lot in terms of how we're interacting with the person, and what kind of safety net we can provide them, so to keep everyone who's part of that interaction safe. And again, acknowledging biases, you're going to hear me repeating this quite a bit. Erin, so I think we're gonna, or you will, be split into breakout groups in a moment. I was hoping that you can introduce yourselves to each other, because I'm sure there are people from various work context, sorry, and to kind of share with each other what's the most challenging aspect of trying to support someone experiencing psychosis or crisis due to crystal meth use, like either to you personally as a worker, either in terms of challenges that you're seeing in terms of the system and supports offered, or even in terms of like physical layout of the space where you work. Like I've heard various things brought up that kind of keep stumping, you know, the teams or agencies in terms of like how to shift certain things. So you'll have 6 minutes for this, and if anything comes up that you think should be shared in the group context, please feel free to put it in chat, or like if some questions arise as well, please share it in the chat. I hope everyone's rejoined us now. If anything came up in your breakout rooms, if you have a question, if you have anything to share in the chat, I just see someone said too short. Absolutely, there's going to be another opportunity closer to the end. You're going to be split up in the exact same groups, so you'll be able to catch up with the same people you were having a conversation with, and you'll be able to reflect or integrate some of the stuff that I talk about in between the two breakouts. I also saw someone mentioned that their staff are trying to support a student who's using, like in terms of attending school. Yes, it's like the challenges that people who work with experience are so varied, and frontline staff really have to be ingenious to kind of find ways to help people fulfill certain things that all of us take for granted day to day. I also wanted to mention I worked also from the medical aspect and supporting people who use crystal meth with one of the physicians from Inner City Health Associates. And again, we haven't documented all of this officially, but one of the things that kept coming up, a lot of the people, at least from the community that we worked with, had ADHD diagnosis and were put on Adderall as teens. And I'm not claiming causation or even correlation aspect between the two, but this is something that I've noted that a lot of, especially people like in their late teens, early 20s, who use quite a bit of crystal meth and come into contact with social services, there's also frequently disconnection. As I mentioned earlier, we will spend a lot of time referring to psychosis because that can be one of the most intimidating parts of dealing with crisis or trying to de-escalate someone. But also the reason I mentioned some of the stuff earlier is the half-life of methamphetamine. So when someone's been using it for quite a while, the amount of methamphetamine that they have in their body really overloads their central nervous system. So they can become irritable, they can experience high levels of anxiety. Their behavior might become more erratic than it normally is. It might not be as intense as psychosis, but they might start becoming suspicious of people around them, start suspecting that you're not who you say you are. And all of these things, depending on the context, can present a lot of challenges when we're working with people, or a situation that normally wouldn't be unsafe can quickly escalate into something that's a safety concern because of this aspect. The same with crashing and withdrawal. People shared with me that like the crash is so intense, it's so draining, and quite a few people that I worked almost daily with, we've had this really unusual kind of territory where people people share experiencing such intense depression that it brought on suicidal ideations. And I know it's a very tricky territory to navigate when someone discloses something like this. We're legally bound to follow certain protocols, but having understanding where this comes, like on the continuum of use, I think it really makes a lot of difference in how we support that person, because a lot of folks that we work with have a lot of trauma related to mental health care system or being apprehended against their will. So kind of talking it out with a person, coming up with a plan wherever possible does make a huge difference. And again, a different sort of crisis can arise as a result of this point in time of use. Psychosis is what a lot of people encounter, and define as crisis, and it can be really intense, really overwhelming, especially for the person experiencing it, which a lot of times, we're so focused on safety, we kind of forget what the experience is like for the person. One of the things, again, that I noted for a lot of folks is like they end up experiencing auditory or visual hallucinations. And I remember one of the most educational exercises for me, because like I can't empathize with that, like in a sense that I don't know what that feels like. I remember we did an exercise where like you sit and you have two other people. Well, now with COVID, that's probably not doable, but at some point you might want to do that with your colleagues on a team, where two people are telling you like really emotionally intense, potentially triggering stories, like two different stories each ear, and then you're supposed to concentrate on a conversation with a third person. Experiencing that just for a minute, it really illustrated like at least that one point of the experience for people experiencing psychosis due to crystal meth use. And I think it's a beneficial experience, learning one. You change how you speak to the person, you change your interpretation of what they're experiencing when you understand that part. Here we go. So this is the piece that I know is of most interest to a lot of people, and we'll be relating a lot of the practical things will come down to this. If you know the person, if you know it's crystal meth related, it helps with certain physical aspects and how we're supporting them, supporting the person. But any or all of these might occur, and like when you look at them listed like this, for me anyway, like this seems so exhausting. Like, can you imagine experiencing a couple of these at the same time? And my thinking is like, no wonder people start to act out. This might be so overwhelming. Hearing, seeing things that are not there. One of the most common ones that I've seen frequently is like people are convinced you're not who you are. I've been told that like I'm actually a cop who took over my body. It's like even people that people trust, they can't trust their own brain to tell them what's real and what's not. And that in itself is terrifying. A lot of times when people lash out, when they start having a fight with someone, it can frequently be someone who's not even there. And like, for instance, in drop-in setting, in emergency room setting, people end up engaging in a fight because they made eye contact for a second with someone while they were saying these things, and things can snowball very quickly. Understanding that they're talking to someone who's not there can really help you like redirect them or like move them from that space. Incoherent speech, like inability to follow kind of linear conversation. A lot of times, I mean, I talk a lot, but people talk even faster than this, and it's so hard to keep up with what they're saying or like what it is, the need that's agitating them that they can't have met. Like trying to break all of that down as a worker or a person interacting with them, yes, it can definitely be intimidating. Another thing that comes up a lot, is people talk about good and evil. Like a lot of religious stuff comes up, angels, demons, God, Satan. And I know it can be really challenging, like navigating that narrative and trying to make the person feel safe. And does it really matter? I mentioned this before. It's like, yes, it's helpful for us in terms of de-escalation, to know if it's crystal meth use related, but in the grand scheme of things, our focus is to help person feel safe, feel grounded, so that they end up feeling safe, we end up feeling safe, everyone kind of walks out of the interaction without more trauma. And again, one of the things that I keep bringing up with our team, because we work in a system like behavior punishment, people have to have consequences. And I mean, a lot of us are dealing already with compounded grief and loss due to opiate crisis. And though crystal meth doesn't have that such logical, extreme consequence result, the reality is that a lot of people using crystal meth also end up dying in our current system, whether it's also because opiate use to level off their crystal meth use, whether it's because of other health factors that were compounded by their use. But the real danger of the person we're working with being cut off from supports, being cut off from the system, so they end up dead, is real. And I don't mean to make things depressive or dramatic, but I think this needs to be part of our conversation when we're kind of deciding safety level of working with someone. Because I think a lot of it is, I mean, in all the years I've done this work and all the de-escalations I've had, even that involved a weapon, like when person was experiencing psychosis, I've never been harmed in any shape or form. Like no one's ever touched me, nothing negative happened. And I like to share that with the teams. It's not because of any superpower on my end, but it's really from the knowledge, when to step away, when to give person that space, but also really realizing that the person's not aggressive or violent, but that their behavior comes from the place of fear. I think Erin's going to share our second poll now, and this has to do like with your experience de-escalating people in psychosis, or how frequently you've had to do it, whether you have still some concerns. And I believe Erin's going to share the results with me in a second. And as you're choosing your response, I'm just kind of dive in. I've already touched upon some of these. I know someone mentioned the PowerPoint presentation. My PowerPoint is pretty detailed. Like even if you jumped in halfway through, when you get this after, I think it's going to be self-explanatory. And I think some things are best illustrated as we're talking about challenges. So if you take anything from this presentation, I know some of us interact with people in crisis and we've never seen them before, but I also know a lot of us work in the context where you do see the same people over and over and over again. So you do have that opportunity to build rapport. Um, in terms of de-escalation, this should be your number one strength. This is your opportunity for connection, to build that trust with the person when they're not experiencing crisis. This can be the factor that determines how easy your de-escalation is going to go. And I mean, again, in terms of staff that I work with, one of the things that I ask is like, well, you're telling this person not to engage in this behavior or to do something. Why should they listen to you when in this moment they don't trust anyone? What have you done for them to earn their trust? And like, we have to remember, whether homeless or not, like, if people are coming to us for support, odds are they do have trauma, they do have issues, around trust, abandonment, and then they're experiencing this a really warped sense of reality. Why should they trust us? And this, for me, this has been the key ingredient in a lot of the interactions that I've had with people. From like the simplest things of like asking the person how they are, what they need, when they're not in crisis, like from simplest things like getting someone a freezy when they're overheating, or just asking them even like post crisis if you can build that relationship. Because I think one of the things that happens is like person has this experience, they're put in the system, we decide about the consequence, and by we I mean like systemically, and they're told what their consequence is, but very rarely along the way anyone asks them what that experience was like for them. What did they feel? What did they see? Like, what did they hear? What triggered some of their behaviors? And I think carving out that time, if you have that opportunity in your work, like it teaches you so much for your future interactions, but I think it really strengthens that bond. For instance, my thing with all of the people I've worked with, I have a rule and they know it. This is regardless of crystal meth, but I found it particularly useful for crystal meth. I don't lie. I don't fib. If police are on their way for whatever reason, I will tell them. I will walk them through the experience. I will be with them the entire way, but I will not lie to them. And it comes in so handy, when they're experiencing that kind of challenging, what is real, what is not. I can call on that. I like, we're told like not to force eye contact, or like maybe to avoid eye contact if people are too jittery, but that has been in my experience like my biggest strength, like making that eye contact, reconnecting that person to that sense of safety and well-being that we build when they weren't experiencing crisis. I mean, it can bring things down like so many notches, and then we can focus on what's actually freaking them out in the moment, instead of being like, okay, how do we sidestep this crisis? Practice patience. One of the things I think that's super common in our line of work, nobody has a lot of time. We're all like go go go. Your caseload, case notes, meetings, and one of the things that I find throws people off balance a lot when it comes to crystal meth related psychosis is because it's usually very time involved. You might be stuck for a couple of hours dealing with this, and I know it can be really hard to kind of like get that sense of patience to emerge from you when we're all tired, burnt out, we're dealing with so many things. But even faking it until you're making it, kind of just channeling that sense of like, I have all the time in the world, can really shift the dynamic when the person's in crisis. It becomes really about them, not about the behavior. It's like, I'm here for you. We're going to work through this together. It doesn't matter how long it takes. Like, I'm not going anywhere. I'm not abandoning you. I'm here for you, not to tell you to stop behavior. And I have to tell you, like, this works even with people I've never seen before. I mean, I work in a neighborhood when stuff like this. I've only worked at Dundas and Sherburne since the beginning of the pandemic, and I've had situations where I've just like walked out of our space and walked in the middle of something where, I mean, based on experience, you can tell that odds are it's crystal meth related. The person doesn't know me from Adam. Um, but I approach them with like, you know what? I'm here for you. I have nothing better to do today. What can I do to make this better? Like, what's going on for you that it's scaring you so much that you're kind of like stepping in the middle of traffic, that everyone's making you feel so angry, intimidated? Like, what part of that can I make better for you? And it's really consistent that people really respond well to this, because it's also you're giving them the gift of your time, and when they know they have time, they're not as stressed out in terms of like trying to work through what's going on with them. um Bringing your A game, and this also plays into the whole talk of like biases that I mentioned before. And you know, like, we're all told all the community members are the same, you know, we like everyone, it has to be fair. I mean, reality is we're also human. You know, we form different levels of attachments to different people. I know I do. And I do things differently for people who are my favorites or who I'm closest to. And one of the things that I find is like when you're working with someone and you know you're feeling anxiety because you don't know them, or there's something about the way they're acting that's triggering you, invoking this, like, if I envision my favorite client, favorite person to work with, and what kind of allowances would I make for them if they were showing this behavior, um, I'll tell you, like, more often than not, the interaction is really going to change. And that really like challenges our personal biases, which again only make us human. It's normal that we have them. It's how we work around them, and how we control the parts of the interaction that we can control that creates a safe space for the person. um, Another thing is, majority of people that I've met that work on front lines, they all have their own little niche, like that thing that makes them good in crisis, or like the thing that they invoke when they work with a particular situation, zeroing in on that, like, you know, what are the things that I'm really good at? Or if you're not sure what it is that you're good at, to ask your colleagues, to ask your teammates. They'll usually give you good insight. And then seeing it's like, how can I take this skill and then build it into something that's really going to help me translate consistently, you know, to create the safe space, to be confident in my ability to deal with this situation. I find this is one of the best advices I can give you, is because then that skill is going to be yours. It's not going to be something that I or anyone else needs to tell you. Again, this keeps coming up, but like, don't assume that you know what the person needs in the moment. It might not be even what they're telling you. You know, it might be something like they're barefoot and they need socks, but they're upset over something else. As I mentioned, I'm very animated, I'm very hyperactive, I'm very loud, but when I'm interacting with someone who's experiencing crisis, like, I bring down everything so many levels. I try not to be so animated. I try to soften my voice. I try to talk way less than they do. It's more about hearing them and giving them the space to tell you what it is that's really triggering them. And I find that kind of like letting them be in charge of the dynamic as much as possible, unless you need to redirect something, will really give you more opportunities to figure out what is it that's actually kind of feeding this kind of discontent, or their sense of fear in the moment, and it's going to increase your chances of addressing this behavior. And fear, again, both yours and theirs. One of the things that people share with me, and it's like a lot of people retain memories of what was happening even when they were experiencing psychosis, but even if they don't remember specific interactions, they do remember how you made them feel. And that can make or break your future relationship, you know, especially if you're a case manager or like worker in charge of this person's kind of future planning. You really want to think that like their behavior is coming out of fear. I might be acting certain ways. because of fear, kind of like how do I sidestep both of those, like reassure the person and kind of ground myself so that this interaction goes the best way possible. Self-awareness, again, I mentioned like how I talk, like even from little things like knowing that you have a meeting, or checking your phone, checking your stance. Another thing is that you could be the best person to de-escalate the crisis in the whole wild world, but in this particular instance, uh, something about you just triggers the person. And like I've had that as well, like just the mere fact that I'm female or that my hair is red, recognizing that like just your presence is not leading the interaction to go a certain way. And if you have the opportunity to tap out, if you have a teammate who can step in even for a couple of minutes and then you kind of start from scratch, I think that's one of the things that we most often forget. Like, you can step out, like, and we don't have to be like heroes just because we were the first person there, or like because we're that person's worker. Like really being self-aware in that moment, like whether are you the best person to continue this de-escalation, this interaction. I think it can lead things in the right direction. Another thing is space. I know people feel very, very overstimulated when they're experiencing psychosis, and we all have limitations in terms of space, but even like, kind of pushing everyone back when people want to watch things, or like just taking that extra step back when the person's asking you for space, it can make a huge, huge difference. And again, lack of space, I know the biggest thing is like if a person can be in a space that's not overstimulating, that's not too loud, that's not too bright, but we don't always have the luxury of that. So kind of being creative in terms of how we create that bubble, even for the next little while. This is a very common one. So we can't say yes to everything that the person's asking, but if you say no, but blah blah blah, all that person's going to hear is no. So try to be creative, like, even offering something similar or not directly saying no. Again, like just trying to focus on maybe what you can do, I think it can make a huge difference. And I mean, this is the one that's relevant for any kind of de-escalation. You know, if you're tense, if you're scared, you're probably channeling that to the person. So being really, really aware of your stance, taking that deep breath, just kind of like closing yourself in that bubble of interaction and being like, I have all the time in the world. This is going to go really well. My only care is this person's safety and well-being. If you're channeling that, the interaction is probably going to go better than you can imagine. And as I said, if you have an opportunity to talk to the person about what their experiences has been, like for instance, I mean, I knew from reading and things like that, people end up feeling overheated and like they feel like their body's on fire. But then someone shared with me how he was on the subway and like this like hot flash overcame him. He felt like he was going to explode unless he takes his clothes off, and that's why he ended up being naked in public. Like it really, I don't know, it made things more personal, and I could understand why things happen. The same with like methamphetamine can kind of enhance sexual behavior, sexual suggestiveness, and then someone who never talks to you like that can sexualize you or like make comments that make you feel uncomfortable on a personal level. But kind of trying to divorce that from the person and tying it, like especially when it's context specific, and having that conversation when the person's not experiencing crisis can change a lot of things for your future interactions with the person. There are a couple of other things, but for the sake of time, I can mention these when we come back. I was just hoping that for the very end, you can all go into groups again and kind of talk it over. What of this is relevant to your work? What of this you see yourself adopting, or like has any of this kind of triggered your thoughts on like changing, maybe not your own, but like your team's way of dealing with things, that this made you think of other creative ways that you can interact with people. So
Thank
welcome
you.
back, everyone. I know there's never enough time. Again, if anything came up or questions came up during your discussions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I'm just going to try to wrap this up. And Olivia was kind enough to gather together the questions that you already shared. So I'm going to try to address some of them. The first one was around challenges getting people to wear masks, like particularly people using crystal meth. One of the things that we've been doing is we got a donations of like handmade masks that had like really interesting designs, like they were very creative, engaging. So getting people to pick their own mask, that reflects their personality, kind of engages them. Um, it's more than just here, we're telling you to wear this. They're part of the process. And one of the things, at least with people that I've been working with, a lot of them tend to be, drawn to color, to activity, to creative outlets. So that kind of engages them differently. Second was speaking to value of peer workers. Like lived experience is so valuable. Any workplace that has the opportunity to engage people with lived experience, I think makes a huge difference. And um, I just tend to caution people not to put all the pressure and responsibility then on someone with lived experience. That's a skill, but I think a lot of times the interactions, especially related to psychosis, can be time consuming, really involve a lot of emotional energy. So just to be careful not to end up putting everything on the peer worker. Um, there was a question whether age plays a factor in terms of psychosis. Um, Again, I really wish there was more. I've been like searching internationally in terms of research around crystal meth use, and I found close to nothing um, that's related to people without stable housing or with other insecurities. I can just share again unofficially, like we've been documenting super carefully, like all the work we've been doing from psychosocial and from medical aspect over the last couple of years. And the only correlation that I've noticed, again, not official yet, but I've heard it from other people as well, is if a person has a pre-existing mental health condition, and it can be, depressive disorder, anxiety disorder, attention deficit disorder. um, I noticed there was a higher likelihood that they're going to experience psychosis from prolonged crystal meth use. I'm really not sure. I'm not a neurologist. I'm sure there's a lot of space for research to be done. Currently, among the population that I work with, crystal meth use is considerably higher among younger people. So I would say like teens to like mid 30s. So I don't know if it's the age that plays the factor or if there's more people in that age group that use crystal meth. And the fourth one was around God, Satan, like the religious aspect. Again, this is something. So my background was like in clinical psychology, and I had a lot of opportunity to work with people diagnosed with schizophrenia, and this is very common in that population as well. So I don't know, again, if it's something that's related to brain chemistry, if the way crystal meth stimulates the brain or overstimulates the brain triggers certain connection. And that's why, because I've seen this even in people who are not really religious or don't talk about religion in any context, like when they're not using. So a lot of opportunity for research. If I had more time, I would definitely dive into this. I just wanted to wrap this up to saying like if you take anything from this training, like or really want to think about things more, it's really focusing on how to build connections with people, have patience, and under flexibility, what I mean is like really thinking outside of the box. From what I've seen in the field, people who are really best at these kind of de-escalations or teams and programs that did better than others were ones who kind of like threw out this is the system, we need to make people fit within the system, either they do or they don't. Rigid systems don't really match up with the challenges that people using crystal meth currently experience. So if you're able to think outside the box, kind of see the patterns, if certain issues keep occurring, like thinking of different solutions. So one of the things that I can share, I was at St. Stephen's House, now the neighborhood group, like up until March this year. And one of the common trends among the population that we were working with is like almost every single crystal meth user in our space was obsessed with bikes. And there were so many issues related to bikes. People would take up so much space outside in Kensington Market. They would steal bikes from each other. There would be fights with bike parts. So we took that knowledge and we started a bike group. Like we created a safe space, indoor, inside. We actually partnered up with police, which is not very common, but this was particular like neighborhood officers in Division 14. And they ended up like getting us the tools and stands, and this ended up this safe, interactive space. I should also say that community members asked for these two particular officers to join us. It was not agency mandated, but it ended up being this really interesting, different, creative space to engage people. Also, their buy-in in terms of wanting to be in the space increased. And that helped us when they were in crisis, reminding them, like, you know, let's walk away from this. You want to attend the bike workshop and stuff like that. So if stuff comes up in your workplace and you can't think of solutions, please, again, feel free to email me. I'd be more than happy to engage with you in terms of like some creative thinking. Also, towards the end of this presentation, like one of the last slides I included, are questions for your teams or for your agencies. Like if you want to tackle this on a larger scale, like I've put some useful questions that can maybe prompt the discussion and take it in certain direction. Yeah, I saw somebody says debrief after incident and self-care staff, and that's incidentally my next slide. I just assumed that because that translates a lot from like typical you know, procedures after any sort of incident. I just didn't want to I spent a lot of time on that, but like, yes, I really think it's super important to debrief, and not to debrief about the incident itself, but more about feelings, because I know a lot of intense emotion can come out of these like such long and like heavily emotionally invested interactions, that I really try, if it's possible, not to send your staff home like without talking it out, not talking about restriction, not talking about the consequence, not vilifying the person or the situation, but just kind of trying to make sure that people leave those intense emotions so that you can continue to support that person in the future. If I would open it, we're almost done. So if anyone has any questions, please, I'd be more than happy to answer them. Or if people want to unmute themselves. I don't know, Erin, if that's a possibility, if people just want to.
Yeah, people can unmute themselves to ask questions.
Yeah, if anyone feels brave to talk in front of the group. I'm tired of listening to myself talk. I really want to be relevant to your particular situations. Olivia, did I skip anything from the list that you compiled?
No, there is one about, just like a recent one about labor. How do you offer support for a woman experiencing meth withdrawal during labor?
Oh, okay. So I should mention, so I worked with Dr. Tomislav Svoboda. Like, I know he's not the only one doing this. I know some of the doctors on the East Coast were doing this. Prescribing dextroamphetamine as a substitute for meth, and like I know there's been a lot of conversation, like for our community members who are pregnant, because withdrawal can be more, just like with opiates, can be more stressful, put more stress on the body and like endanger safety of mom and baby. We've seen a lot of quote unquote success, or like people have reporting more success in certain things when they were prescribed dextroamphetamine as a substitute to meth. Fewer side effects, like, you know, controlled pharmaceutical versus something on the street, and it really helps both with physical and some of the aspects of like mental withdrawal. Again, population that I work with, more men than women, so I didn't have a lot of a high number of people who were pregnant and experienced labor, but I know that this was the case in some of them. And I know that a lot more doctors are looking into this kind of substitution therapy to help people bridge this gap.
Another question is, I work for CAS. How can you assess use with parenting ability long-term?
Oh, so as I mentioned before, there's a huge difference, like a lot of, I wish I had concrete numbers, but a lot of people use crystal meth recreationally, or you know, they're housed, it's kind of in control doses. I mean, Adderall is prescribed, a lot of similarities. Crystal meth use in itself does not mean that the person's going to experience psychosis. I've known people who've used for years and never once experienced psychosis or any of these extreme behaviors. So from my perspective, you know, someone's parenting abilities should not be put into question by the mere fact that they use crystal meth at all. I think the issue arises more like, you know, if there's a pre-existing mental health condition and then, you know, they did experience psychosis, they don't have any other supports. Like on my end, I would involve the parent and kind of try to build the structure of safety around that. But the mere fact that someone, you know, admits to, or you know that they're using crystal meth, does not automatically put their child in danger.
Another question is, do you have any skills for acknowledging personal self-biases?
So honestly, conversation. That's why I said like team debrief. So I was the coordinator, now manager, and I really think, you know, in terms of personal biases, you know, if leaders of groups acknowledge theirs, so I would openly talk with my team, you know, when a certain part of the interaction or certain behaviors or just certain personalities really brought out the worst in me, or like really made it challenging to bring my A game to the table. You know, talking about it like it's something normal that all of us experience, I think really changes the dialogue, because I really think, I mean, all of us are overworked, burnt out. There's so much pressure on all of us, but at the same time, our systems are set up in such a way that we always look at clients or people we're working at and their behaviors and the threat they're posing to us. I've very rarely witnessed, you know, debriefs that really look at like, is there something that we could have done better? Not like, oh, you did this wrong, but it's like, was there anything in this dynamic, you know, could we have driven, you know, the interaction to a different space? It's not about like individual responsibility, but to me, that's the space also to acknowledge your personal biases. And I know it can be very tricky, like if the person doesn't have a high level of self insight, but as I said, creating that safe space where all of us are just kind of questioning ourselves, I really think that that leaves a lot of space for growth, for opportunity. It makes the team stronger. And I mean, I'll be honest, I'm sure, like I can't, and even I, like I've done hundreds of de-escalations, but I can't anticipate every single one. And I'm sure I didn't do my best in every single interaction. So there's always room for learning. So, you know, creating that safe space where people understand that they're not being questioned, they're not being judged, that no one's going to look down on them if they acknowledge their biases, that's actually going to make them a better worker. That's my only suggestion for a strategy.
There's 2 questions overlapping about resources that, like further resources.
So I can send you, I know like, so if any of you are attending next week's session, I know Janet Stevenson, like one of the managers that I work with, and Diana McNally from Toronto Drop-In Network are going to be there. I know there's a series of webinars that's at Stevens Community House made available, and they include information from people with lived experience. I can also email those links to the organizers so they can share with you. Also, there is a group of recordings on Ontario Harm Reduction Network that was recorded a year ago or so, and also includes experience from people with lived experience, which I really am sorry that I couldn't include that today. I love to engage our community members in these type of conversations. Again, I can share both of those links. I think they're very, very helpful for like, you know, learning more specifics, not just about de-escalation, but really understanding the dynamics behind issues.
And I'm just jumping in because I know we're close to time. Olivia, are there any more questions, or can we?
We're good.
We're good. All right. Well, I just want a huge big thank you to you, Sanda. I'm so glad you shared your passion with us today, and you gave us some really amazing coaching on helpful things to do and ways to approach challenges when people are not doing well with their crystal meth. So just a huge big thank you. And a great big thank you to everybody who made time to attend. We will be sending out an evaluation. It will have Sanda's slides and attached in the PDF. Sounds like it might have a couple of links to some training resources as well. So that will be coming out shortly. We will ask you to please give us your feedback on the evaluation. These sessions really change based on what you tell us. And really just hope you can come back and join us again. We have our 3rd session next week, as Sanda was just doing a great little warm up for them. The folks in the TDIN and the neighborhood group will be coming, both staff and lived experience clients, and to share what they're doing, which is working in terms of engaging the wisdom from the client group and ensuring that that comes into service design. So thanks a lot, everybody, and wish you all well, and hope to see you again next week. And Sanda, just a great big thank you.
Thank you.